Today we're going to look at a part of our history that affects England and Scotland. We're looking at the time just after the conquest of Wales, when Edward has conquered Wales, Edward I, remember from last week, and he then puts his attention to conquering Scotland. He's not as successful with Scotland as he was with Wales, even though on his tombstone in Latin it calls him the Hammer of the Scots. He didn't actually conquer Scotland. What's the word? He didn't conquer Scotland decisively. He had some success and then he didn't, and then we're going to find out about that and how that happened. So after, he's sorted out Wales and he's turned his attention to Scotland. Most of what we're going to learn today is actually, rather than being about Edward, is going to be about the Scottish king, whose name was Robert the Bruce. And he comes up against Edward a number of times, and Edward's son. So let's find out. So I'm going to read to you from a book which I will send you, and I will send you the attachment from this, and I'll add some bits in as well that aren't in the book when I need to. So, when he'd conquered Wales, Edward I began the conquest of Scotland. He defeated the Scots lords and made himself the King of Scotland. He even took away the Stone of Scone. Now, you may have heard of the Stone of Scone. Sometimes it's called the Stone of Destiny. Now, this big stone, it was a big kind of lump of stone, was where all the Scottish kings had been crowned, and they would sit on this to be crowned. Now, so this was a huge insult to the Scottish to have it taken away from them, and it was placed in Westminster Abbey under the throne where the kings of England were crowned. And it stayed there from this time, so the 1270s, I suppose it was, maybe a little bit later than that, or maybe it was 1296 that it was taken from Scotland, and it wasn't returned back to Scotland until 1996. So it's only been back in Scotland for about 20 years, 25 years, and it was actually away from Scotland for a long time, 700 or 800 years. Which is huge. And so the Scots were really cross about this. So Edward took that as this huge insult. It says here, this was the stone on which all the Scots kings had been crowned. Edward had it taken to London and put under his own coronation chair in Westminster Abbey. Edward was to find Scotland very difficult to rule. The Scots lords were soon planning revolts against the English king, and the most successful of these revolts was led by a very famous Scots king, Robert the Bruce. You might have heard of Robert the Bruce, but you'll know a lot more about him now. Robert the Bruce was known as a fine leader and a brave warrior. There were thousands of Scotsmen who were ready to follow him against the hated English. Messengers rode from village to village spreading the news of the revolt. Edward I knew that he would have to defeat Bruce or the English would be forced out of Scotland. The English king ordered his army to ride north to join the English soldiers already in Scotland. Bruce gathered his men and prepared to fight, and the two armies met at the Battle of Methven. In the English army, in the English army was a strong force of longbowmen. Now, I don't know if I've talked to you about longbowmen before. These were the archers who used a bow which was almost 1.8 metres tall. It was taller than a tall man, really, and that was the actual bow. Huge, they were huge things. It was so powerful it could drive an arrow through armour, and a good archer could fire a second arrow before his first had landed. And these made England very successful in successive wars later on as well, and we'll talk about them in the 100 Years' War next week. But these longbows were fearsome. People were very frightened of them. So it was these longbowmen who began the English attack. The Scots suddenly saw a rain of arrows coming towards them. Men and horses were killed before they could escape. Then the English knights thundered towards the broken ranks of Bruce's army, and the Scots fought back bravely, but they had no chance. Those who could fled from the battlefield, leaving many of their comrades dead or wounded. After the battle, Bruce managed to escape, but Edward was determined to have his revenge. The leading Scots lords were either hanged or kept chained to the walls of castle dungeons, and they were left to die slowly. And this is our typical image, isn't it, of a dungeon, having someone chained to the walls. And this is what he did, this is what Edward did. He actually left people chained to the walls and left them just to die. I think probably given a little bit of water and food a day, and they would slowly rot away, I suppose. They'd be driven mad because they'd been in so much pain from hanging or not being able to move very much. Now, he was particularly awful to Robert the Bruce's wife and sisters. He managed to. They were sent to one of Robert the Bruce's brothers' castles for protection, but he didn't manage to protect them. So Edward caught them, and he, when Edward got them, he put them in cages and hung them over the walls of castles. And I think a couple of them lived in these cages hung over the wall of castles for 4 years. Now, if you can imagine, you're in a small cage. There's no toilet in there, is there? There's no food. I don't know if they lived out there all the time, or if there was food they must have had food and water put in them. But you're open to the elements. Scotland's not particularly hot country, but they managed to survive for 4 years. I don't know what happened to them after that. That's something I need to find out. But it is a particularly cruel punishment, and they were just because they were married to Robert the Bruce or were related to him. So it says here, some were killed, others thrown into prison. The English king thought of a horrible punishment for the sisters. One of them, she was imprisoned in a wooden cage, and the cage was hung over the wall of Roxburgh Castle. That's where she was trying to be safe, and obviously got captured. Now, Bruce fled from one hiding place to another. Sometimes villagers sheltered him, sometimes he hid in caves in the forest, and it was during this time that he was said to have almost given up hope. Now, this bit of the story that you're going to hear, you've probably heard before, and if you haven't heard it before, you will have heard of the phrase or the saying that comes from it. So it was one day as he lay tired and hungry in a cave, he watched a spider making a web. Time and again the creature fell from the partly made web. Still it struggled on, never giving up until its work was finished. As Bruce watched, the tiny creature gave him renewed strength. If a spider could try so hard, surely a king should never admit defeat. So this is where we get the phrase, if at first you don't succeed, try again. And so Robert the Bruce took inspiration from this spider, and he tried again, and we'll find out whether he was successful. So in 1307, Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots as he was called, died. Okay, so this very wise, brave, brutal king who's managed to control the Welsh and is trying to control the Scots, he's now dead. And the king, his son, Edward, becomes King Edward II. Now, he was not wise or brave or brutal or any of those things. He was just thoroughly spoilt. And he wasn't interested in war. He was just interested in high living and fine things. And apparently he used to walk around with a pet lion on a chain. And his only thought was of enjoying himself. So he wasn't a very... Robert the Bruce got lucky, actually, in having him as a leader to fight against, because he wasn't really interested in fighting. Sorry, trying to make you... Right, turn the page. So that was in 1307.